What's up, guys? Welcome to the Troponin episodes, episode 18. I think I was supposed to say, what's up, YouTube? But hey, friendly reminder, if you're enjoying these episodes, first, we have so much more content available on teamtroponin.com. But if you're not a subscriber to Team Troponin, you can subscribe to the YouTube, like, comments,
notifications,
share, and let us know if you are Team Nut Butter or Team Guac for added fat. There's only one right answer to that question.
Guac.
Yes.
No. But we want to start off today's conversation with some training variables, I think.
The off-season weight gain?
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about off-season weight gain and kind of making a big jump in stage weight. And with the kind of the question being, how much weight can you gain in an off-season? Good weight, not just fat, and really expect to be able to bring it to stage. I think this is particularly relevant to both of us because we've had both a couple of really good off seasons. But for myself, I feel like I'll put on a ton of size and it look a little bit deflated by the time you get to stage. I mean, it's still a huge jump in stage weight, but it's hard to make that big jump in weight look great kind of the first time around, the first time you've taken it to stage. So, Justin, what's your take on this? Like, if someone's got a year of off season, how much can they generally expect to gain and actually have it show well on stage?
I don't know that I could give a number, but I can say probably why. We've talked about like the myofibril and sarcoplasmic growth and beef jerky versus a steak. And when you're on stage, you're as close to beef jerky as you're going to get, So yeah. That's really the myofibril. So, any myofibril growth is going to be there. That's, you're not losing the protein structures in the fat loss. You're going to lose some sarcoplasmic growth. And so if you have a banger of an off season, and almost by definition, if you do, you're going to have a higher percentage probably of the sarcoplasmic stuff versus the myofibrillar stuff. So if it's 80% sarcoplasmic and 20% myofibrillar, you have 80% of that growth that's going to have some level of decreased size and prep because you're going to be flatter. You're never going to be off season full. And so I think that's really what it is. And then whatever fullness you do keep, again, you haven't had enough time to add a ton of myofibrillar growth, and that's what's going to look like. That's what's going to look hard and grainy and not bloofy. I can't remember. I think Get Big back in the day used to say like
bloofy. What a great
word. It was GH15.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And so and it's a perfect word because you can understand exactly what we're talking about, like that bloofy look. And if a really good example is you can go back on the old muscle magazines and look at the 1995 Mr. Olympia versus the 1996 Mr. Olympia. And that was the first year insulin was really used heavily. And everyone was bloofy at the 96 Olympia. By 97, they kind of got it under control a little better and learned how to use it better, and know there's only so much fullness you can push and still be dry. But you can really see there, everyone looked enormous on stage, but it wasn't as good of a look it wasn't as mature of a look as 95. By 97, it was back to a better look again. And that's where Nasser Al-Sambedi, especially from the front, was just a mutant, and that's probably the best analogy. You've got the 95 guys where everyone's up 15, 20 pounds in 96. By 97, everyone's roughly the same weight, but it's a different look again. And I think that's really what it is. Because when you gain all that weight really quickly, by definition, it's not going to be all protein structures. It's going to be a lot of the extra stuff. And then there's just a lot more variable for that to go up and down in prep and how well you nail the fullness. And if you really nail the fullness, you're probably going to look, more bloofy again. It's not going to look as mature. And so I don't know that there's a number for how much you can gain. Obviously, the less you gain, the more immediately mature that can look on stage, but that's also really slow progress. So that's not the goal you want to push long term.
Is there a percentage that you'd like to see in a great versus a pretty good versus a not so great scenario?
I think, unless this year is your last year competing and you're trying to set the record for most Mr. Olympias won, you should not, your focus should always be long term, And so I don't think there probably is a cutoff and a percentage, but that whatever that is for the absolute best look possible this year means that you're not creating the most growth possible, which means the next year you're not going to be as good as you could. So I think it's one of those things. Kind of, I guess, an analogy would be, I remember in college, in football, I would still weight train really hard during the season. And so many guys wouldn't because they didn't want to be sore at the games. But my thinking is, it's okay, my strength level's here, right? yours, so both of our strength levels here, over the course of the season, yours is dipping. And so by the last game of the season, you've lost a lot of strength. Yes, you're not sore and you're at 100%.
Yeah.
But so game one, we're both here. I'm actually only here because I might be a little sore because I'm still training hard, but I'm getting stronger all season. And so my 90% on that last game is double what yours is. And I feel like that always worked for me because my stats would always improve throughout the season. Everyone else would lose 10, 15 pounds, get weaker, where I didn't treat it any different than I did in the summer or in the winter. I still trained hard, and so I was still getting stronger throughout every season. I think that's, like that, putting all your eggs, like, and I understand, like, I want to nail it for this show, but then what, if you held things back so you could look perfect on this show, what happens next year? Now you're not as good as you could have been. And so it's a tough one, like if you're trying to turn pro, there might be a time and a place to do that. But even then, like, you might not turn pro, and then next year your chances are even less. So I just think you always push as much as you can and then make it the best look possible.
Well, even in the shorter term, though, I mean, we're kind of talking about this maybe a trade-off between nailing your conditioning for a show versus making big progress that off season. But wouldn't you say, like, you could make huge progress in an off season in terms of muscle gained? You'd end the off season with that, bluefier look. Maybe you got a little softer, but couldn't you still nail the conditioning by the time you're at the end of a prep? It's just that the end result might be a little disappointing compared to the huge jump in stage weight you hope you would make.
Yes, and that's exactly it. Yeah, and it will be better overall. Yes, but I still think if you added a ton of weight, you're going to add stage weight, but a large percentage of that stage weight is still going to be that sarcoplasmic fullness. So you still might not look as gritty, but again, that the next year, like if you could add 15 pounds every year, for 4 years, by then you've added 45 pounds or whatever, and that 45 pounds with striated glutes, even if it still looks a little bloofy, that's better than not having the 45 pounds.
One question I had, and we were talking about this weekend, is like, let's say someone's really, really hitting on a body part. I'll just use myself as an example. I've been hammering my legs, and
they're really coming up too.
Results. Yeah, they have been. Part of that's been through manipulation of frequency and kind of redistributing some of the workload. But at some point, like let's say I go back to normal leg training, like once or twice a week. Is there a chance that improvement doesn't necessarily mature or maintain? My thought is probably not, and if anything, it's just going to be again like some of the fullness just from like acute stuff that you'll get from training and post training, and then hitting that multiple times per week. You're basically sustaining that acute response.
Yeah, I think and I have no idea what percentage that would be, and so really we're just guessing on this because, because there's going to be some inflammation that's going to promote the swelling, but that's not even a good look anyways. Right. My thinking is that you'll just go back to you won't lose anything really. You just won't progress. It won't continue to progress faster.
And that's good for people who are listening to hear that, like, let's say you're really, really prioritizing a body part. You don't have to always keep, like, you're not going to lose your progress if you shift priorities. Because at some point, like, that's really what bodybuilding is. It's like, it's that game of, like, always bringing up the weakest link. And once your weak point's a strong point, that's going to have to shift again.
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing that people do wrong. You just said, you like bringing up weak points. You can try to bring up weak points, never hold back a strong point. I see that all the time. People I don't get it when people are like, yeah, my legs grow too much, so I'm not training them for only training them once every 2 months. Well, yeah, so they're going to get smaller. Like if everyone was only as good as their worst body part, if you brought your entire physique down to the level of your worst body part, we'd all be terrible bodybuilders, other than than the top 5 in the world, And so that's the worst approach. Even if it leads to having like not great symmetry. Like Branch Warren's a perfect example. When Branch Warren turned pro, he was chest and legs.
Yeah.
So if he would have taken that approach and held back his legs and chest, he would have just been a 175 pound bodybuilders or something. So what he did was he prioritized his other body parts, but he didn't stop doing his good body parts. And so his chest basically stayed the same, his legs stayed the same, and the rest of his body grew around it. And then he became 2009 top 2 at the Arnold.
Yeah. Going back to what we just said about like pushing for a lot of progress versus holding back in like the hopes that you'll maybe win a pro card or something. I just thought of the 2 most recent USA winners, and neither of them did that. They did the opposite. Because if you've been following the last couple of years, you had Jordan Hutchinson in 2021 and then Stuart Sutherland this year, and they both had huge off seasons. I think Hutchinson took like 2 years off since his last show at least, and he put on a ton of size, and he started that prep, I mean, pretty fast.
Pretty soft, yeah.
And he did a really long prep. I think Tuttle does long preps in general, but he prepped for like half a year, and he came down and he was absolutely shredded, and he definitely like, I guess, lost a little fullness along the way, but he still came in super sharp. And then Stewart's kind of he's just kind of a mutant. He looked incredible. I don't know if he lost any fullness, but I think he put on like at least 20 pounds of stage weight too in a year. So
Yeah, I never understand that when guys are like almost at a pro card, and so then they just completely switch gears to just trying to refine things. It's like, like yes, then you might sneak in, but why not just continue? Like your progress was like this. Why are you going to be like, I'm going to level it off here and just tweak things now because I'm close? It's like, why don't you just overshoot it and then go on stage looking like Ronnie Coleman? Then you don't got to fine tune anything. Then you just dominate.
yeah, I feel like it's fun to look at the pro ranks and like have these intricate discussions about refinements and this weakness versus that. But to my eye, it seems like until you get to that level, it's like you always say, it's a conditioning game, and beyond conditioning, it's do you have something freaky about you? And worrying so much about those little refinements and bringing up weak points is kind of like you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're limiting the real progress of like getting huger and getting leaner.
Yeah, if you're year 6 as a pro and you've won some lower level pro shows and you're top 5 at the Arnold and top 10 at the Olympia, yeah, then that's the time when you got to like find out the little tiny things that what gets you in the top 3. But short of that, if you're not at that level, that means you have a lot of work to do. So quit, don't get out the fine pen, get out the big fat brush and make major changes.
It's interesting too, just having been around Martin Branch a little bit during Martin's prep for the Arnold, like even them, like at that level. And I honestly, I thought Martin looked great. I think the judging at the Arnold was very, the top 4 just had 2 very different looks, right? You had people like James Martin who came in shredded and big, and then obviously Andrew and brain.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Andrew Jack like just throws me off. When I see a photo of him posed, I'm not usually that impressed. I'm always like, I could have had him in third, or But then when you watch him transition between poses, if you took a photo of every transition when no one's hitting a pose, he's the clear best bodybuilder on stage. So I don't know if it's like Paul Dillette syndrome or what, but something happens and it's like he loses pop when he should be gaining pop. There was one, I think I just saw on Instagram. It must have been a video, but it was about to do a rear lat, and there's a point where he's like just starting his rear lat, and he looks like Ronnie Coleman, and then it's like something happens. Yeah, he's spreading his lats, but it's like all the pop just goes away, and then by the time he hits the full lat spread, you're like, yeah, it's a good pose, but something looked insane when he first started. I don't know what he does, but
It's interesting being around those guys though, because even then, like, they just train really hard. And the thing that they really dial on the details on, and the things they have the absolute most control over, like their posing, their presentation. Like they don't worry about all the things that someone who's just trying to turn pro. I mean, and turning pro it's a big goal, right? So I don't want to downplay it, but even these guys competing at the top of the pro levels, like, you ask Martin about just training, he's like, I just train really hard.
yeah,
Watching him and Branch go at it is freaking cool to see.
That's what so many times I have a client, and they'll like want to know what their weak points are, or what they need to work on, and they're 176 pounds. It's like you got to work. You got to work on gaining 100 pounds. That's what you got to work on.
Like my girls that compete in any division, it's like, what's your feedback? Glutes. You think?
Yeah.
Like, every women's division, judges are going to say glutes.
That, or they might say like delts or lat weight.
Yeah.
That's the only thing you'll ever hear.
On that note, sometimes I feel like I have almost a shitty attitude about this, but when people talk about getting judges' feedback, if it's like a local show or even bigger than a local show, and you didn't win, the feedback's probably going to be like, you need to be bigger and or leaner. And if you nailed the prep and you got in shape and you peaked properly, then that means you just need to get bigger.
Yeah, and if you don't know what you need to, if you need feedback, you're going to have a tough time. Like self-analysis is. And that's why you get so many people who like throw their trophy when they don't win, when they clearly shouldn't have won. People just are bad at self-assessment. And if you need a judge's feedback, if you need someone else to tell you what you need to work on and you have no idea what it is, that's a red flag you need to figure out. Because I can't remember any time in my career where I didn't know exactly what needed to improve, and if I got judges' feedback, that's what they said. But I already knew that, obviously. You should know it.
Right.
Like I look like this. The top guys in the sport look like this. I can see, these things need to change on me to look like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that actually seems to carry up into the pro ranks, even among people who manage to get a pro card. Because I've seen interviews with pros when they're going into a show, and the interview will toss them some generic question like, "How do you think you're going to place?" And they'll be like, totally honest, they're like, "Oh, I really think I can win, or at least break the top 3." And then they go to the show and they place like, 12th.
Yeah,
maybe.
You think, how are you ever going to win if you're that?
I don't talk about it.
If you're that far off, if you can't tell, or especially you can get a little lost, like if you aren't around a lot of bodybuilders, you only see yourself, you can kind of it's a little hard to self-assess. But when you see pictures of yourself and video of yourself on stage, and you're, wherever you placed, and you don't understand why you weren't higher, you're not going to go far. You have a hard time in the sport because you're never going to be able to. How do you go back home and fix the things you need to fix when you don't even know what they are? And then, like what David said, especially for the men, 99% of the time, it's just get bigger. The pros are big. If you want to be pro and you're in the 160-pound on stage mark right now, there's one thing you need to know. The smallest division is the 212, and those guys are killing themselves to make 212 at 5'2". So,
yeah. Get bigger and get a bigger back. Everybody needs a bigger back.
Yeah, hamstrings, back and hamstrings. Basically, what's not fun to train in the gym, or what's hard, I guess, depending on what type of person you are. It might still be fun, but it's hard.
Yeah, it's my favorite session, but
yeah, but it's the hardest session.
Yeah. So I think we had a question on the last YouTube video about. It was just kind of a broad question about training chest and shoulders or training push with a rotator cuff injury, and how do you go about that? So I'm going to toss this one to Danny because this is her area of expertise, and I'm guessing that right off the bat you're probably going to say something like, "Well, what about your rotator cuff?" It's a little bit, it's a too generic a question, I'm sure. So where would you go with that?
Yeah, I'm pausing because I'm like determining how I want to actually come at this. How nerdy can I get?
People like nerds. I mean, they're like, listen.
Well, I'll make a deep dive on this on the Team Troponin site, just looking at what actually is going to influence shoulder and chest mechanics. But one of the things I'm mentioning in my Swiss talk in a couple weeks too is one of the very first things I look at for people as a reference centers of what's happening with their rib cage, what's happening with their sternum. Because if you think about it, if you view the body from the side, sternum, rib cage, everything that's going on in between those two sections is going to tell me what surface your shoulder blade has to sit on, and what's going on with the shoulder blade is going to tell me about the orientation of the ball in the socket. And when I say orientation, I mean what position is that ball sitting in? And that's one of those concepts that I think people really don't talk about or even think about enough. It was actually something that came up in our Team Troponin Discord too, was things that don't get talked about enough in rehab, and I would say like the orientation of joints, because everyone's a little bit different. But when it comes to actually training through these areas, I think it depends on, you have to understand a couple of key concepts before even figuring out what you can train. Is how irritable is it? What's its chronicity? What's the structure that's actually affected? Like, is it actually your rotator cuff, or is it your pec, or is it something your labrum, or is it just painful and you're calling it rotator cuff because it's kind of a blanket term you can put on the area. But if you don't know what you're actually looking at, it's really hard to get a course of action. But in terms of like macroscopically setting up a program, I could talk about this for so long. Can you give me like a bigger, like more pinpoint question with it? Having read
that wasn't my question.
You're probably going to be best served having one movement you can still push, probably something that's stable. And this is where I would use an intensity technique to allow training to be your rehab in a sense. But I would make sure that whatever technique you choose is one that works with the implement. So like if you're doing a seated shoulder press, for example, Taking something like a rest pause rather than a cluster set is probably going to be better, because with the rest pause, you're only going to be starting off the bottom 3 times versus the cluster set where you're going to 5, and that bottom position is probably where it's going to be the most precarious for you.
Or you're assuming like a machine shoulder press.
Yeah, like plate loaded, whether it's like the hammer strength, the prime, or any of the weird cables or
The ones that start from a dead stop.
Yeah, anything that starts from a dead stop down here. That's going to be the hardest position for you. But scaling that back is going to, number one, force you to scale the weight back to a load that you can tolerate. If you can perform every single rep within that intensity technique with the desired intent of controlling every point in that range of motion, you're still going to get crazy output from your delts. You're still going to be able to grow, and it's going to be an implement that is easy to control. Beyond that, you're going to want to have something that probably challenges stability. So something like a banded incline press would be really good. Something that allows your hands to rotate in a way that works with your shoulder joint. However, if you have different sitting elbows and wrists, you want to look at that, because that's going to tell you a lot about what I came to first with how's the rib cage sitting, rotated scap, all of that. But something like a banded incline press at whatever angle works for you is going to allow you to manipulate hand joint position in a way that's comfortable for you. The accommodating resistance is actually going to force stability and force things to start to stabilize together. It's also going to offload the point of the motion that feels probably not so great at the very bottom. And then beyond that, your isolations, you're going to have to be very, very picky with your body position. And I think upper body, even more than lower body, is my favorite thing to look at how we can make training actually rehabilitative for you. But it comes down to keeping the goal, and with every movement, there's going to be a different goal. And if you're not having a specific goal with each movement, you're really missing out on some incredible progress that you can have. Mm-hmm. Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, the question was pretty broad, and so I think we're just trying to give the audience some takeaways that they can go ahead and start applying. Because really, if you have a really specific issue, you would work directly with somebody like that.
Yeah.
Well, you could also, I would say that if you have if you have that broad of a question, I'm going to guess that you haven't seen a specialist to find out exactly what your problem is. That might be the first step,
Or
so you actually
email
know.
to one.
Yeah, so you know what your injury is, rather than because then you can actually have a plan of attack for it.
Well, but even beyond that, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most specialists suck at treating our population.
Yeah.
And that's actually a point of bringing up in Swiss too, is that we don't fit the textbook models that so many clinicians, whether they are a physician, a PT, chiropractor, whatever, we don't fit their models. And so I kind of have this collection of people that work with me and are like, hey, I've tried everyone in my area and no one can get me better. What can you do? And I'm like, hang tight. But I think the most important thing to do and to recognize is that because you don't fit the models, you're probably going to need to find someone that does understand what you do. And there are so many of us out here. I had something I was going to say. Sorry.
I have a follow-up question, though.
All right, lay it on me.
Do you think there are any cues that people generally apply to pressing movements that are maybe hurting them more than helping them? When I think of that question, the first thing that comes to mind is the old, powerlifter cue of retract your scapula as much as you possibly can during any pressing movement and keep them locked in place, which, just given how the pec works, if you're doing a chest press, probably isn't a good idea. Mm-hmm. But is that cue or other cues maybe harming people, and if they just stopped doing it, they would have better pressing mechanics off the bat?
I think a better way to answer that question might be, instead of saying don't do XYZ, I would instead redirect and say that you probably need to find what I would call a new reference center. So many of us do life in front of us. We're so attuned to everything visually in front of us. We're more aware of the front side of our body, kinesthetically. And what I try to encourage people to do is find a different kind of reference center, something that tells them proprioceptively where they are in space and feel. Because again, that all goes up to the brain, and the brain kind of says, okay, here's where we are, here's what we can do output-wise. But I think for most people, especially with pressing movements, if you can re-reference instead of everything in front of you, if you can re-reference the floor and the posterior section of your rib cage, especially for bodybuilders, that's probably one of the better things you can do with most pressing movements.
On the retracted... Go ahead. Well, on the retracted scapula thing, there's not that many people that would be around long enough to. I don't remember that being a thing before, like already into double and triple ply shirts, which was 20 years ago now. But I remember, 25, 30 years ago, I don't remember ever hearing that. I don't remember ever hearing that until triple ply shirts, like real early 2000s. So I wonder how much of it is, yeah, that does work when your chest isn't doing any of the pressing, you know?
Yeah.
And some of these cues too that we hear, especially in the context of like, do you depress or do you retract, rather than thinking either or. I'm explaining this to a client this week. I think about them as two independent variables, to where they each have a volume switch or a continuum on a pendulum or something, right? To where maybe instead of just depress or retract, you find kind of a sweet spot of both of those. And I don't know if that makes more sense, but that's generally how I think about anytime we're looking at setup. People like to think about it as black or white, and the reality is for most of the things you're feeling either or, you need both. And it's probably a more question of can you sensitize yourself to find some level of volume of both of those measurements.
Do you think, while we're on the topic of scapular position, is scapular position in and of itself that you really want people to be thinking hard about while they're pressing, or would you rather them focus on some of the joint position? Like, I'll just, using myself for example, I don't usually have that many shoulder problems. I tend to really just think about where my elbows and wrists are in space relative to one another, and a lot of the other things tend to fall into place.
Yeah, you just kind of hit on the idea of like trajectory and arm pathing, right? Mm-hmm. And that is ultimately going to determine what muscles you're using. I think the two things I coach people into for both rehab and training are the same, and it's your reference centers, like what are you tethering yourself to neurologically for stability, and what line of pull are you actually working into.
It's funny you said bar path. I just remember there's no more argument of like arc or S path on a bench press. Have you guys seen that? You remember that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Is that still a thing anymore? 'Cause I remember like Powerlifting USA, like the S path.
So my memory of that is that, again, I think a lot of the cues that people adopted maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago came about as the popularity of gear lifting like increased, and as the equipment got more and more supportive, I think you got to a point where the bench was like almost a tricep extension. Hence the shoulders back because you're barely doing anything with your pecs. And at that point, I think at some point people started saying, well, you should press upward, or excuse me, you should press in a straight line up. And I think almost anyone who's benched raw, like without equipment, realizes that you need at least some upward arc. You use your pecs and shoulders. Most people do, at least. This isn't black and white. But what about you?
I'm thinking.
Yeah, because I remember in Powerlifting USA, or probably like 94, 95-ish, there was, because I remember the diagram, the S path was, it comes off your chest and then back and then up. And there was an argument for that path versus a straight arched path versus, I don't remember if there was anything else, but I remember I was, like 15-year-old kid, and I was like, S, that seems like a lot of weird motion. I'm trying to get the bar out, not zigzag it through space. But it's funny because I don't, when you just said bar path, like before, like the start of this, and I hadn't thought of that in years, but I don't really feel like I see that anymore, or at least
I think the new en vogue thing is making sure that your setup is just right for every exercise. If you're doing your lat pull down and your arc is off, you're clearly not getting anything out of it. And at some point it's like, oh my God, people are like, are we going to train, or are we going to sit here and like, I can't tell you how many emails I get from clients, a lot of which are either females or men who've been lifting less than maybe 5 to 8 years, which again is a big range, but they'll ask like, well, so-and-so says that science says this, and I'm like, does so-and-so look like he actually lifts? Like, I hate to say it, but there are so many internet snobs talking about technique, and they don't look like they've ever touched a dumbbell or barbell in their life.
It's bad. One of my big pet peeves with clients now is, and I hope no client that does this is listening, but is the coach, I know you're supposed to, and then the next thing that follows is not what you're supposed to, but it's like whatever they're here is being presented as absolute fact. And so I know you have to do this to do that. It's like, well, no, you don't have to do either of those to do that at all. But
and I think that's the hard thing, because we live in an age where there's so much exposure to these different ideas, and there's constant noise. And so as a coach, I don't know about you, but I know for me, I feel like I'm constantly in an upward battle against whatever someone is seeing on social
Yeah.
And it's hard because you don't want to be that person that's like, no, don't X, Y, Z and come off as like negative Nancy. So it's always the question of as we're coaching, how do we reframe in a way that not only like gives the correct answer, but equips people to think better and to ask those next questions of like, okay, well, why would someone make an argument that this is what you're supposed to do?
Yeah, that's what I usually try to do is I would say, yeah, well, yes, if we were doing yada, 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 then that would be one of the better ways to approach it. But we are not doing yada, yada, yada. So,
Yeah. I hate how people will like poo-poo the idea of looking at the physique and strength of the person giving the advice. Like, it's absolutely valid. I can see the reasoning, because every once in a while you will get some great content out of someone who doesn't look like anything. I mean, I know that Lyle McDonald looks like he hasn't touched a weight in his life, and he's produced some brilliant work. But for the most part, people who have good things to say are going to look like it in this industry, at least. And so
yeah, it's because it's the type of industry. Because I could see people making an argument like, well, my hitting coach in baseball doesn't look like he can hit the ball 500 feet, but that's like. This sport is kind of unique in that you don't just stumble upon it. You pretty much you're probably going to have a personal interest in it, in building your physique before you learn all those things. And so if you have that personal interest in building your physique and those things aren't working for you, that's a pretty telltale sign.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a pretty telltale sign too, where maybe this is kind of a separate topic, is like, let's say you get on social media, how do you know if someone's actually worth listening to? And I think one of my red flags is if you get on someone's profile and if they're more interested in sounding like an authority than actually like putting out good content, I feel like that's a pretty big red flag. There's a PT right now who...
The mic drop red flag. That's my biggest pet peeve now is everyone wants to well, no, you can't do this because you got to do that. Boom. It's like, no, that's not, yes, you're not arguing with anyone. You're just making a comment to the ether. So yes, you can mic drop and no one's there to, make a rebuttal.
There's no reverberation.
You can delete the comments you don't like if you really want to.
Yeah. And so that's the big problem is because that, and there's a couple of names that I used to respect quite a bit that I see doing that more and more. And what sucks is that's what gets followers because you're not doing it in a peer reviewed, method. You're doing it in you're talking to people who decide who they're going to listen on based on popularity, and that sounds like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. He dropped a mic.
People like polarity because polarity takes out the decision fatigue for us.
Yeah.
So the more polarizing someone is, God, I've started following people just because they had a freaking opinion to follow, and I was like, okay, I don't have to think. If this person tells me what to think, I'm just going to consume it. And I think that decision fatigue is a lot of what separates people who actually make a lot of progress from those who don't.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're looking at who to follow and you're genuinely confused, which is understandable, you want someone who can explain the why behind why they do things, but who is still making consistent progress with themselves and with their clients, and who has achieved, I would say, someone who's achieved a high level in the sport. Maybe they didn't turn pro, maybe they didn't have the most amazing total, but, well, no, Danny's a great example. She has achieved amazing total, and she has turned pro. And she's got plenty of content.
It's different though. I think especially for men, because the number of pro cars that go out for women per year is.
Dan, you've done very well. That's the point. And you put out a lot of good content, and you can explain the why behind this or that movement, a whole lot of things. But then you will still post a video of yourself deadlifting, 4 plates for 10 plus reps, and that's incredible. And so.
Where do you guys get those fake plates, by the way?
Destination's got a nice pile.
Where do people get fake? Because what would they be? Aluminum or wood? Who makes those? Styrofoam. I've never looked. Now that I'm curious,
can you go from? Oh, you're actually serious about where do people really?
Well, I don't know why that popped in my head, but people. Well, because I know the Weider photo shoots used to be with fake plates, and so I'm assuming they had aluminum plates. They probably weighed 10 or 15 pounds or something. But that's, if you're the Weider Corporation, you can find a metal shop and get those made, but that'd be expensive. I'm just curious now, because some people, there's got to be a place online that sells them. I'm going to buy some.
So my first exposure to power building ever was Bradley Castleberry.
That's exactly who I was.
And
I don't think any of his weights were fake. I think he was very clever in that, like most of his real crazy stuff are all pictures of him standing with the bar this far above the rack with like 10 plates, like he finished a squat, but he clearly just stood up a quarter of an inch, or with someone spotting him on bench, and that's misleading because you can put I could put two fingers on the bar like this, and David could probably bench 600 pounds with me, because
he might be at 500.
but because the bar's not rolling, so you get a lot of leverage. And so it like with Castleberry, is always stuff like that, because he used to train at the same gym Dante did, and he was strong, but he was like normal strong person strong, like I get a few reps with 405 on bench. But if you get a few reps with 405 on bench, you could put 585 on and find anyone in the gym, and they're going to be able to pull 200 pounds. Any guy that works out, on a rack dead, 200 pounds, that's all he's got to pull. That's nothing,
Yeah.
I remember those forum threads on Intense Muscle with people accusing Castleberry of using fake plates, and Dante would come in and be like, "Guys, no, he's not. Just the logistics of that alone are silly. Like, who's just fabricating fake plates that somehow look exactly like all the other plates in 24-hour fitness, but are actually 5 pounds instead of 45."
Yeah, but it always cracked me up because it would be like the real crazy stuff was always like a photo. I could stand. Or like a well spotted lift. I thought it was pretty clever. I wonder what kind of.
So if I load up like 8 plates per side on a hack like Dave does, and I just unrack it, will people?
Yeah, and just stand there. Or think how much Dave could pull without even looking like he's pulling. Just putting his hand on the on the hack. And, he could pull 300 pounds all day like it was nothing. Probably 400 pounds. Yeah. That's a good idea actually.
That's our next photo shoot.
I'm putting up some big numbers this week.
Yeah, you are.
Spotter.
Cora might be able to help you.
Yeah.
Maybe.
She tries to. She almost killed us both in squats a couple times.
Really?
I have a video on YouTube at the old house. Yeah, I'm squatting, and she's doing a balancing act on the floor bar, the crossbar at the bottom of the squat, and of course she trips and falls into me. I only had 315 or something, but I was supersetting sissy squats. I was doing critical mass. I was supersetting sissy squats. The
superset of tears.
Yeah. Oh my God. And I think she bumped into me, and I think I might have tried to do one more rep, and I realized if she did that again, I'm crushing her.
We're going down.
Yeah. Yeah. That bitch ruined my workout.
For anyone who doesn't understand, Cora is Justin's. How old is she?
She's 6. Yeah.
She's 6 now.
6, okay.
Yeah.
She's got some funny attitude. Okay, can I ask what the poop drawings are about?
I don't know. That's Dark Side Cora.
Dark Side Cora.
So she doesn't do it much anymore, but there was a period of time where she would get kind of I don't know, mean looking, and she'd say, "I'm not Cora, I'm Dark Side Cora."
I'm gonna start doing that.
Yeah.
I'm sure you are.
Yeah.
So, one more topic. I don't think it was a question, just something.
I have one question too.
Just also, we're way out of sync again. I don't know if you guys have noticed. When I say something, when you guys laughed, it was 3 seconds after I made the comment.
Oh. I'm pretty sure Remotely takes care of that, but I will take a look.
I'm just saying for smoothness. When I start interrupting you, it's not intentional. That's the reason.
Okay.
This what always happens, and I start looking like the jerk because I'm bad about waiting, and then I swear there's a pause, and then I start talking, but it wasn't the right time.
Oh, well, they all think you're a jerk anyway, so
yeah, fair enough. Dark Side Justin.
Dark Side Justin Cider is what it was.
I don't think they see that.
That'd be great if they did.
I know.
Did you want to do Greg's question?
Yeah. Wait. Sorry.
You said you had a question.
It was. Oh yeah, we can talk about frequency too. It was something that someone else at the gym asked me about. If you guys go lift at a gym, and it's a gym where people are coaches or therapists, and you have questions for them, please wait till we're done with our workout or text us, because we're really, really short on time.
They don't bother me. I look like a dick. They bother Danny.
Yeah.
You got to become Dark Side Danny.
Cool. We do have okay. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about training frequency before, and to be honest, I think I I totally poo-pooed it before in terms of a variable that's really worth manipulating in and of itself. And I haven't exactly changed my opinion, but Danny and I were talking about this earlier, and I think there are probably a number of more valid reasons when you get into the why behind frequency, to why you would go with, say, a higher frequency than once or 1.5 times a week when training a given muscle group. So there were a couple big ones that I thought you want to go ahead and give us.
Yeah, so first let's frame this from the perspective of most other conversations that the three of us have had about frequency. We kind of go with the bro split, and it's under the premise of, well, if what you're doing for muscle isn't causing it to grow, why is doing more of something ineffective going to be better? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's been Justin's take on things. And I kind of think there's a rationale for higher frequency at times, but
yeah, your progress recently, I've been realizing I need to we need to put a caveat on that, because I was always viewing it from the perspective of it was a weak body part because you weren't training it properly. You know, I hadn't really considered the fact that you might know how to train it and it's still a weak body part, and in that case, then you do need to come up with a better solution that might include more frequency.
Yeah,
I think that's the question is, why is it a weak body part? And that's the coming back again to first principles. Like, if we're gonna look at a body part, why is it weak? Okay, well, is it weak because you're not training it right? Is it weak because of some neurological issues? Is it weak because of biomechanics issues? Is it weak because of a technique issue? Training variable, volume, frequency, intensity, but
yeah, and actually, but I think Dana's got a much better answer. But before we go into her answer, like, again, just kind of going back to first principles, think about what really makes a muscle grow. We'll kind of put the whole, there's this debate over does metabolic stimulus and the burn and the pump and everything make it grow?
Time under tension.
Like, just put that aside. The main thing that we know makes muscle grow is mechanical tension, or more specifically, you do an exercise in such a way that your muscle is forced to produce mechanical tension as it approaches failure. It doesn't have to go all the way to failure, but under significant efforts, mechanical tension on that muscle. And so, if some amount of mechanical tension is going to make the muscle grow, if you're not training it properly, that probably means that you are not requiring that muscle to produce very much mechanical tension. You are shifting the load basically to other body parts. If you are training it effectively, then that means you are stimulating some level of growth. And so to say that you don't need more frequency is basically to say that you're getting enough stimulus for a good rate of growth, however often you're already training it. And to increase the frequency, or at least increase the volume, and thereby also require more frequency, you're basically saying that we want more chances throughout a week or throughout a microcycle to do that same thing. So that's just kind of like specifically what we're actually trying to do. And so the question is, once you doing that properly, and then two, how often do you need to do it? So we were talking earlier about the whole practice thing, like getting better at producing a mechanical tension, and then beyond that, do you actually want to prioritize it?
So I've realized that just in working with people, as much as we want to say, I'm not going to touch on the semantics of muscles activating or not, it's another conversation, but as much as people want to say they are or are not getting great use of a muscle, most people are pretty bad at actually training muscles. Like, they're really pretty bad at it. It takes a lot of skill. There's a lot of internal focus on an external situation, and it's hard to marry those two very different things. But in both training and in rehab, one of the things that I see in people a lot is they just need practice actually finding the muscle. And this was the case for me, was that after the adductor injury and a couple of other things, I realized even with the leg extension, I was like, I don't feel my quads. That's a problem. Like, do I think maybe keeping my leg training at once a week is the limiting factor, or do I think it's the fact that I can't feel my legs when I'm training legs? Now, is increasing frequency going to give me better practice? Yeah, absolutely. Am I currently training in a way that it's going to make it very hard to recover if my ability to actually recruit that muscle needs a lot of working on? Probably not. So it's probably not going to tax my recovery all that much. Although that will change very quickly. The neurological learning of actually contracting a muscle and using it, that's very quick. And I want to give this with the context of, like, I'm not this person who like, most people who say they cannot feel or find a muscle, there's not a simple solution. I mean, there is and there isn't. And there's a reason for the inability to find that muscle. And it oftentimes requires just a little bit of creativity and problem solving. This isn't just a like, oh, just think harder about using your quads when you're doing a leg extension. This is like the weird stuff. And I have a couple of clients of yours, Justin, that I work with on a lot of the same things that have made pretty good progress, I think. But with regards to frequency, it's a practice, and it's also redistributing the volume to where if you haven't necessarily trained a muscle hard, effectively, with regards to tension for a period of time, there's only so much that you're going to be able to tolerate within a session. So to really be able to grow that muscle effectively and get, quality working sets, and you may fatigue early in a session and thereby almost require 2 sessions to get in kind of a truly minimum effective dose that's a stimulus for hypertrophy, not just neurological efficiency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you mean because I've seen you train the last few weeks. Mm-hmm. So using yourself as an example, I mean,
Well, I'll use someone else, just because it's a little bit more humanizing, I think, if it's not just, this is me, and I'm, I've got a client who had a really bad quad tear, hamstring tear, both on the same side. He could not feel anything on his right leg or hip. And he's actually someone that I'm doing a case study on Swiss as well. And most times, for men in particular, you're not going to see them training leg twice a week, and if you do, it's going to be split up into quad and hamstring. And we actually went general leg both days, like quad, hamstring, glute on both days, because he required the time practicing those certain movements. And when he actually got good at, like, let's say he got really, really good at hack squatting. Really good hack squatting took it out of him enough that we couldn't do a whole lot more than just his quad sat session because they were already pretty fried. So it's like, okay, well, what do we do next? And so I think that's been a really interesting thing to look at as well. And it didn't necessarily affect his recovery poorly because the actual number of sets and the absolute intensity, like he's, when he's actually figuring out how to get quads firing, he's not hitting 8 plates per side on the hack. It's like a reverse band at something, more moderate. So it's not going to fry his CNS in a way that leaves him completely, obliterated for a week. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the kind of TLDR here is if you really suck at activating a muscle, at using a muscle, higher frequency can be a good means to basically practice the skill, because it is a skill, of using that muscle. And at some point, if that's going well, you are going to get good enough at using that muscle that a few hard sets may become taxing enough that you either don't need that frequency anymore, or if you're going to continue that frequency, you can only do so much volume per session.
Yep, exactly.
And I think back would be another great example because so many people have a weak back because it's just hard for most people to find the lats. So if you really suck at using your lats, that might be an argument for a fairly high back training frequency, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. But at that point, you might just be doing some, I won't call it like light or piddly, but just it's the best lat training you can do, which isn't that great until you get much better at finding your lats. And at that point, hopefully the progression might be such that you get so good at using your lats that you could end up putting a back session into a bro split, and that would be all you would need.
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily consider that the end all be all of this progression, but that's one way you might take it to where you're training back just like any good bodybuilder is who's known how to find their back since they started lifting weights.
I think the people that do well on a bro split are the people who connect very well, who've never had any sort of major injury, because that's probably the biggest thing I've seen as a PT is that anytime there's been a major injury, and it doesn't matter where it is, there's going to be some downstream effect, and it's probably in some weird place that you're not thinking of, and you're like, oh, weird. So the people that do really, really well in bro splits that I've talked to, when I'm like, hey, have you ever hurt anything? They're like, yeah, no. Maybe a little back soreness or like back pump is like their issue. But I think it's really important to remember too that anytime a textbook says you should be feeling X muscle with a specific movement, if you're not feeling that, then there's probably a reason. And the best thing you can do is ask that next question. And the more you can ask that one more question, that's going to be really important. Yeah. Again, kind of coming back to social media where it's very in vogue to say that this particular muscle always does this action is not the case. And you're not broken if you're not feeling like the right muscle. Your body's been very efficient for you. And if anything, it has given you a strategy that you probably wouldn't have come up with on your own otherwise. But you need to re-strategize.
Yeah. To add one thing, I think there's another way you can think about frequency and like a reason to use a little bit higher frequency. That's kind of the opposite of the way people usually do it. Usually you would think of using a higher frequency for a body part or a movement that you want to prioritize. lately I've been using a little bit higher frequency for the muscles, not the ones that I'm like deprioritizing per se, just the ones that I don't have such a high priority on. If I've got 5 sessions a week and I'm not going to train any more often than that, it just goes to shit what I do. And so if I'm trying to get in, say, like 2 back or 2 pull sessions, because that's a weak point, and then the usual, 2 push sessions and a leg day, well, I still want to get a decent amount of, say, like side delt, rear delt, and arm work. But if I say I'm going to do all of my triceps work at the end of shoulders after I've already done 5 exercises for shoulders, that's one time a week when I'm getting in some like kind of meh triceps work. Is how much can I really focus on, say, 3 great exercises for triceps at that point in the workout? The output's going to be just kind of so-so. But I can do, like, say, a couple of really hard, say, like rest pause sets on a couple of good extension movements for triceps at the end of 2 different push workouts. The magnitude of stimulus of each of those sets and the total amount of volume through the week has been enough that my triceps are still growing pretty well, even though I'm not exactly prioritizing them. And that's the reason that I use higher frequency in that case. Do you ever do that with people? Mm-hmm. Because you just can't prioritize everything.
And that's just it. And like we talked about this earlier this week too, Justin, where it's like it's never a question of like what are you deprioritizing. It's just what's your recovery, like knowing that you can only get so much growth in a week. Mm-hmm. Like what are you allocating most of that to? So I don't think that the frequency and the volume and the intensity, like, yeah, they matter, but it's really what are you pushing the hardest and what are you not. And frequency is just one way that we push or pull and make sure we get the work in.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's fair to say that frequency is more like the output of an equation, not the input?
That's a really good way of saying it.
Yeah.
It's a really good way of saying it.
I feel like I didn't make that up. I think I heard Israel actually say that at some point. Mm-hmm. He was in a different context. He was saying that the load you use on a given exercise for bodybuilding should be the output of an equation of like what can I handle, what's my technique, etc. It's not the thing that you decide ahead of time arbitrarily. It's the same. That's
really good.
It's the same thing with your frequency. Like, I feel like in bodybuilding in general, people make this mistake a lot. Like Justin with insulin. I like your approach because you say we're going to base the insulin dose on the amount of carbs we're eating and how soon we do or don't go hypo. Not the other way around where we just eat carbs to cover an arbitrary amount of insulin and then get fat. So it's the same way with your training frequency, your training loads.
Yeah, people do it all the time with weight. Yeah, it's you pick a weight and then find a way to move the weight regardless of whether the muscle's working.
I think that's where like we've talked a lot about progressive overload and trying to get one more rep or something like that with, standardized form, standardized technique. And I feel like it's really important that every now and then you actually pull back and re-standardize. And I'll tell Dave often that like I think you need to re-standardize because we get so married to progressing that for that one extra rep, and there's a fine line between doing whatever you have to do to get that extra rep so that you're progressing, and again, like losing the intent. You have to keep the goal.
Yeah, and as much as like I love training with progressive overload in mind, it works and it's fun, and like I'll look forward all week to a session where I'm going to move X weight for X reps, but yeah, at some point you can't let the weight be the goal in and of itself. At least not for too long.
One thing I do
is training effectively.
One thing I would do fairly often, or not fairly, or periodically, would be when it felt like I was kind of getting to that point where the focus was only on the weight, not the muscle. I would back the weight down and see if I could control my form or something, and still get the same level of taxing on the intended muscle at a lower weight. And if you could, then that's the form you should be using, because that's the form that maximizes the load on the intended muscle with the minimal amount of accessory stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we do with the restandardization of like execution and.
Yep. Like yesterday, I was like filling up the gym has like these plates that are it's thicker than you would want. Like we're using the Cybex squat press, which like it's my favorite leg press. I think both of ours. It's fantastic, but it is one of those machines where you can load kind of an impressive looking number of plates. But the weight, like the leverage and the how close the weight is to you when you're moving it, it's like, 10 plates isn't so amazing as people might think. But the plates are kind of thick, so I'm like filling the thing up and I have no more room. So I'm like, what am I going to do? Maybe I need to change to a different leg press. And Danny's like, no, I'll count your pauses for you. And so I get on there thinking like she's just gonna make sure that I'm not shortchanging the pause. And I bring my legs down and I hold them, and then like she hasn't even started the count yet. And then finally she's like, all right, 3, 2, 1, now push. I'm like, oh fuck.
Well, on that note, the reason that I started we talked about this in Discord too. The reason I started the pause at that point was at that point you were no longer
Right.
yielding. So with weight, we're always either yielding or overcoming, and this is something that oh God, so many layers to this. For anyone that's listening, if you're a PT nerd like me, Bill Hartman is a great resource. I've been learning from and listening to him for years and just absorbed everything I can. Him, Zach Couples, awesome. Pat Davidson too, but they have the concept of this yielding versus overcoming in the context of a muscle orientation of being either concentrically or eccentrically oriented, especially proximally up at the pelvis or up at the rib cage and up at the shoulder girdle. And so for Dave, because his pelvis is stable and I know what's going on with his rotation up at the hip joint and the arthrokinematics there, as he goes through the range of motion, I know that at a certain point he has appropriate concentric and eccentric orientation through different degrees of hip rotation. And I waited for him to actually stop yielding and actually stop and be able to maintain that. And it's different than just eccentric and concentric. Because at any given point in time, a muscle is still probably going to maintain either some variation of a concentric or eccentric orientation. What I mean by that is, if you think about a muscle as like resting length optimally, right? Everything about a helix. Are you familiar with the concept of biotensegrity, Justin?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay, we
Say
touched
that
on
again.
that. Biotensegrity.
I couldn't. You said it so fast. I couldn't spell it.
Biotensegrity.
Biotensegrity. No.
Okay, we can talk about that at a different time, but basically, if you're to think about the length tension in a muscle at rest, I'll talk about this from the context of pelvic floor, which is important for Dave so that he can actually access hip flexion because his pelvis has to rotate. At any given point in time, a muscle is going to be either shorter or longer than its like optimal resting length tension, and that's based on the position of the bones that it's attached to. That concentric eccentric orientation is going to be determined by the actual position of the bones, not vice versa. And as he goes through more motion, it's going to maintain probably that orientation. And for him, just being able to maintain that position is actually going to help build strength and pressure management. That's going to allow him to be stronger on a lot of other things. So for you, yes, the pause is important, but being able to manage pressure through that degree of hip flexion is going to improve your stabilization and pressure management through your hack squat, which is why that's kind of why I was being so mean.
I feel like what you just described was like a very technical description of the kind of rep quality that you often see among just like some really good bodybuilders, particularly in quad and pressing movements. Just like where you're not focusing so much on whether or not there is a pause, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but just kind of like the quality that you see in the eccentric and in the transition to the concentric. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you're hitting on is kind of that intangible quality of maintaining tension and like really loading into that tension and almost using it like this push-pull system and agonist, antagonist, and stabilizing groups. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah. I was going to say, to bring it back to the point of restandardization with your technique versus load, I think be careful that you don't get away from yourself on the body parts that you already consider weak and the movements that are not your strongest. Because I know that I have no problem doing this with legs because I'm relatively strong on quad movements compared to everything else. And so if I'm already pretty happy with my progress and I get to a session where I need to pull back and focus on technique, I'm like, okay, fine. If I'm already weak on pressing and I get to a pressing day where I have to go from like weights that I'm like already about to even less, and I'm like, damn it, I really don't want to have to do that. But it still might be necessary. I was terrible about this in powerlifting because I was a horrible bencher and a good deadlifter. And so deadlift training, like, if it needs to be a 75% day, fine. If it needs to be a 75% day on bench, I'm like, am I really going to handle less than 3 plates?
Oh man, I remember those days.
All right. Ready to wrap this one up?
Yeah.
All right. All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Again, like, share, subscribe, turn on
Leave
notifications.
comments
Leave
with
comments,
questions
please.
below. That's
Yep.
how we get a lot of our topics. So that, and again, you can join the site for more information and for the team Discord.
See y'all later.
Thanks, everyone.
For more content like this, visit www.teamtroponin.com.
This video is brought to you by First Attachment Nutrition, battle-tested nutrition, expert formulated supplements. Join the First Attachment revolution.